Voice of Freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer, Spirit of a Civil Rights Movement.
By Carol Boston Weatherford. Illustrated by Yuka Holmes. The truest thing that we have in this country at this time is little children. If they think you've made a mistake, kids speak out. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Sunflower County, Mississippi. Minister Malcolm X once called me the country's #1 freedom-fighting woman, but nothing about my beginnings would make you think anyone beyond these parts would ever hear my name. Mississippi. I was born here, the youngest of 20 children. My folks, James and Luella Townsend, was sharecroppers in Sunflower County in the Delta, where the soil was as rich as black folks was poor, where cotton was king and Jim Crow the law. When I was born, on October 6, 1917, the plantation owner paid my mother $50 for producing a future field hand. The money helped my family through the winter. Child, I am proof that the Delta birthed the blues.
Ooh. Delta Blues. I was just 6 when I dragged my first bag of cotton down a row. My family, all 22 of us, worked in the field. Wasn't no other work to do. They didn't have no such thing as factories. These factories are something new. From sunup to sundown, dew to dark, can't see, can see. 22-foot sacks over our shoulders, down miles of rows we bent to pluck the cotton blossoming out. As 100-degree beat heat our backs, these dried bristles cut our knuckles and wrists. We picked 15 tons of cotton a season, but couldn't get ahead for our lives. You see, the scale was always tipped in the owner's favor, and so-called share of the crop never be enough to pay back the money we borrowed from the owner for seed, for food, clothes, for supplies. Same sorry situation every season. Black people work so hard and we ain't got nothing to show for it, I was told. And I told anyone who would listen. Sharecropping was just slavery by a gentler name, and the same folks still had us in chains.
Spoiled. I was the baby, and my mother never let anyone in the family forget it. She told my father not to beat me, and she made my sisters and brothers give me piggybacks, even though I weighed more than some of them. I could get into some mischief, too. Like the time I cooked a bag of rice. It boiled over and made a big mess. My father was so angry that I ran off to get away from him. My mother saved me from a beating that time, too. My father wasn't always serious, though. After a long day in the field, he told jokes. We roasted peanuts and all sang together. Sometimes they'd stand me on the kitchen table and I would break into this little light of mine. I reckon I was a show-off. My mother taught me. A strong woman. My mother wore rags patched with rags so her children could look decent. Even as a girl, I knew things weren't right. Whites had food, clothes, everything, while blacks worked and went hungry. One day I asked, why wasn't I white so that we could have some food? Don't feel like that, my mother said. We're not bad because we're black people. Next thing I knew, she had bought me a black doll, told me I want you to respect yourself as a black child. And as you get older, you respect yourself as a black woman. If you respect yourself enough, other people will have to respect you. My mother taught me years ago that black is beautiful.
Fair. School was open 4 months, December through March, when children were not needed to tend cotton. I liked school even if Black history was left out and the textbooks made Black folks seem like fools. I recited poetry and won many a spelling bee. Fair? May I have a definition? Free of bias, dishonest, and dishonesty and injustice. Fair. F-A-I-R. Fair. I sang too, up through 6th grade, and then left to work full-time in the fields. My family needed every hand if we were to ever break even. At 13 years old, I picked 300 pounds a week. But I missed my school books. I gathered newspaper scraps along the roadside and magazines from the plantations' trash just to have something, anything, to read. I was so hungry to learn. My mother drilled this into me. When you read, she said, you know, and you can help yourself, and you can help others. Not much food and rarely meat on our table, often greens with gravy or onions with bread and cornbread. My neighbors gave my mother's chitlins, pig feet, and hogs' heads for helping with the slaughter. Our beds were cotton sacks stuffed with corn, shucks, and grass. We had no electricity, heat, no plumbing, no money for a doctor to look after whatever caused this limp or saved my mother's sight when a wood chip hit her eye. Once my father managed to buy a wagon, a plow, 3 mules, Ella, Bird, and Henry, and 2 cows, Mullen and Della. But a white neighbor poisoned the livestock, just couldn't stand to see Black people getting ahead. That knocked us right back down to doggone dirt poor, doing without. My parents never did get a chance to get back up again. I sure did miss Della's milk.
Not everyone could move up north. Hardship after hardship wore my father down. By the time I was 22, we had buried him. Most of my brothers and sisters moved up north, hoping for higher pay and a better life. I can't blame them. Jim Crow chokes every chance a Black man gets down here. Who wouldn't long for something better? I might have gone too, but my mother needed care. I couldn't bear the thought of her in some nursing home. She was in her 80s, nearly blind and worn down by hard work when she moved in with me. Sometimes I read to her. Other times I'd hear her singing. Songs that would really sink down in me, powerful message songs. I never regretted staying behind. Not a single minute, not a single note.
Worse off than dogs. I married Perry Hammer, Pap as he's known, a good man of few words, steady as a rock. My last name changed, but little else. I joined Pap on the Marlowe plantation where he drove the tractor. I just picked down different rows. I canned produce, Pap shot rabbits and squirrels. We caught catfish and perch. On the side, we ran my father's old juke joint and sold bootleg liquor. We never went hungry, but we were still poor. We couldn't stand that the Marlowe's dog, Old Honey, had its own indoor bathroom while me and Pap used an outhouse because our toilet stayed broken. The owner wouldn't fix it. We said we didn't need it. Besides picking cotton, I was the timekeeper. I tracked hours, worked, bales picked, pays owed, but the boss fixed the scales to cheat us sharecroppers. When I could, I used my own scale to set things right. When I couldn't, the lie weighed heavily on me. Heavily.
Motherhood. In 1954, me and Pap adopted 2 little girls. I sang spirituals to Dorothy Jean and Virgie Ree, just like my mother had done to me. In 1961, a doctor tricked me into an operation, supposedly to remove a growth. I awoke from the surgery to find that the doctor's knife cut more than a small tumor. He had removed the parts that God gave me to bring children into the world. I would never have babies of my own. A Mississippi law at the time said poor folks had no business making babies. That law may have taken my womb, but no one was going to take my voice.
Tell 'em, Fannie. Literacy test. In 1962, my friend Mary Tucker told me about a meeting at William Chapel Church. 4 young men from out of town were pushing voter registration. Not a soul sitting in the pews had ever cast a vote. And then, I didn't even know that blacks could vote till when the people would get out of the fields. If they had a radio, they'd be too tired to play it. So we didn't even know what was going on in the rest of the state, much less in other places. But my hand flew up when the men asked for volunteers to go to the country courthouse and register. All in all, 18 of us signed on for the trip. I was just so curious to go, so I did. I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd been a little scared, but what was the point of being scared? The only thing they could do to me was kill me, and it seemed like they'd been trying to do that a little bit at a time ever since I could remember. An old rented bus drove us 30 miles to Indianola. That was the name or the home of the violent White Citizens Council. Barking dogs and rifle-toting men met our bus. That was supposed to scare us. The circuit clerk only let 2 people in the courthouse at a time. I went first. I didn't know what to expect. I had to give my name, my workplace, and then read, copy, and explain parts of the Mississippi Constitution. I didn't know nothing about the law. No wonder I flunked the test. Now, at least I knew that voting was my right.
On the move. On the ride home, a policeman stopped our bus to arrest the driver on account of the yellow bus looked too much like a school bus. A phony charge if I ever heard one. We emptied our pockets, scraped together $30 towards the bogus fine. Back at the plantation, my boss had already set my stuff in the road. Said they wasn't ready for that in Mississippi. He gave me a choice. Withdraw my name at the courthouse or move on. All I could say was, I didn't go down there to register for you. I was down there to register for myself. Later that night, I left my home and family to move in with the Tuckers. But before long, night riders came around. They shot in the house 16 times, thinking that I was there. I couldn't risk the Tuckers' life. For 2 months, I moved from place to place, hiding out with friends and families. Then I rented a house in town near my family. Soon as I moved in, I marched back into that courthouse and retook the test. What did I have to lose? There was nothing they could do to me. They couldn't fire me because I didn't have a job. They couldn't put me out of my house because I didn't have one. There was nothing that they could take from me any longer. A month later, I heard that I had passed. The price of freedom. Before I could cast a single vote, I had to pay a poll tax I couldn't afford and dodge the night riders who cruised slow as molasses past my house with guns after my name was printed in the paper. Too bad a voter registration card couldn't pay the rent. When Pap lost his job, we got by on $10 a week, raised by those young voting rights workers who opened my eyes to the change a-comin'. I hopped aboard that train.
SNCC, SNCC. Those young folks was something else. Most belonged to SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was called SNCC for its initials. The college kids saw me for a leader. I made it plain why I joined the movement. All my life I've been sick. All my life I've been tired. Now I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I toured the South with words from my heart and spirituals I learned at my mother's knee. I fired up many a rally. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. But I wasn't singing for show. I was singing for freedom. Leadership came natural to me as singing. People took to calling me the spirit of the civil rights movement. Look at that dress.
The beating. In June 1963, I went to citizenship school in South Carolina. On the way back, the bus had stopped in Columbus, Mississippi. Me and the other trainees was hungry and decided to try to eat in the terminal. We ordered breakfast at the whites-only lunch counter, knowing segregation been outlawed. After a long wait, we was finally served, but the bus driver called the police, and down the road in Winona, we got kicked off the bus and thrown in jail. When I asked what was the charges, the police told me to shut up. They put us in separate cells, black and blue. They just kept beating me. The jailers telling me, "You nigger bitch, we're gonna make you wish you were dead." Through the pain, I quoted scripture. One prisoner beat me till we were both exhausted. Then the other took over. I waited 3 days for a doctor to show up. SNCC sent someone to bail us out, but the police locked him up and beat him too. It took Andrew Young from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to get us released. The same day, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was slain in his driveway for teaching Black people their rights. The others said it wasn't my singing what brought them through. The others said it was my singing what brought them through. That November, John F. Kennedy was killed, and Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president. He promised Dr. King to finish what Kennedy couldn't, and in July 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. The blood of freedom fighters was in his pen.
Injustice. The federal government filed charges against the Winona police. I testified at the trial, but the all-white jury sided with the police. The beating left me with more than just bruises and bad memories. A blood clot weakened my eyesight. My kidneys were damaged. My limp got worse, but I was determined. I was marching toward the promised land. Running. Not even a bad leg could stop me from standing up for what I believed in. Hard as we have to work for nothing, there must be some way we can change things. There must be something else. And there was, becoming a lawmaker myself. The next year, I ran for Congress in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Death threats started to come at me soon as I announced I was running, but I didn't scare easy. I meant to prove that anyone, black or white, rich or poor, could get involved in American politics. I cast my first vote for myself.
Freedom Summer. Later that year, I shared stories and songs with student volunteers about what it was like for Black folks in the Delta. After the training, the students set off on a campaign called Freedom Summer. Some be running freedom schools, teaching reading and the right to vote. The Ku Klux Klan killed some of the students. I knew Michael Schwerner and James Chaney really well. They were murdered along with Andrew Goodman for nosing into church fire bombings. If I had known that those young men would have wound up dead, I would have told them to stay home. I cried like I lost my own sons. I could take losing the election, but not this. Still, I had to go on. At a government hearing in Washington, D.C., I spoke about my struggles and how we'd start a new political party in Mississippi because the regular Democrats locked us out. We weren't going to be locked out no more.
(1964) Democratic National Convention, Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was vice chairman of the new Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. That August, we sent a delegation to the Democratic Party's National Convention. We went to make a case that the regular Democrats from Mississippi was unlawful because they did not represent Black people. We went to demand a seat at the table, a voice in our democracy. But we had not bargained on dirty deals dreamed up just to shut us down. President Lyndon Johnson called a press conference just to get the cameras off me when I spoke before the Credentials Committee. His trick backfired. The TV networks taped me and ran my statement during prime time, when the most people would be watching. If the Freedom Democratic Party is seated now, I said, I question America. This is America, the land of the free, home of the brave? We stole the president's thunder, and our support swelled like a storm cloud. Johnson was scared we would cost him Southern support and the nomination. He sent Hubert Humphrey, a pro-civil rights senator from Minnesota, who wanted to be on the ticket as vice president. Johnson ordered Humphrey to stop us. Humphrey met with me, Dr. King, and our party's lawyer. The lawyer told us we should give in and get Humphrey elected. I said that our cause is larger than one man. They didn't let me come to no more meetings. They struck a deal without me. We would get 2 at-large delegates. The rest of us would be honored guests and just sit and watch, not vote. We had come not for 900 miles, for 2 seats. I threatened to slit our chairman's throat if he took the deal. He turned it down. At least 3 state delegations could no longer get away with barring Blacks.
Africa. I can't believe how far fame took me. All the way to Guinea with singer Harry Belafonte. When our pilot on the flight from Ghana was Black, I knew I was in for an awakening. What little we had read about Africa was just wild. At the time, Guinea had just got independence from France. I was so proud that Black people was running the government. I had never even seen Black people running banks. I was sort of sad that I was treated better in Guinea than in my own country. I cried when I saw boiled green peanuts like we eat in Mississippi. And when I heard the same tunes that my grandmother had sung, only with different words. So many things reminded me of home. My ancestors spoke to me. I wondered, could some folks I met be my distant kin? I was angry that slavery cut the ties.
Washington. Back home, I ran for Congress again as a Freedom Democrat. Not to win the election, but to prove that the election needed to be thrown out and that the white congressman should not be seated. Why? Because I had been barred from the regular Democratic ticket and the state had blocked so many blacks from voting. Annie Devine, Victoria Adams, and I took that fight to Congress. We won more support than expected, but not as much as we needed. Annie, Victoria, and I was right there when the decision was read. We were the first black women ever to sit in the Congress on the House floor. But the history-making didn't go to my head. In 1965, I went back to my grassroots work, suing Sunflower County for blocking black voter registration and marching with Dr. King in Alabama and Mississippi. We registered thousands of new black voters in spite of police beatings so bad that Congress was shamed into passing the Voting Rights Act.
Say it loud, Black power. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, James Brown. Black power had become the battle cry of the movement. For me, that meant pride and equal rights. But for Stokely Carmichael, the new head of SNCC, it meant fighting if need be, and it meant having an all-black staff. Hurt my heart to lose Bob Zellner and the other white workers so committed for so long. How could I hate? I mourned whites who died for freedom. I have lived long enough to know that no race has a corner on decency. I feel sorry for anybody that could let hate wrap them up. Ain't no such thing as I can hate anybody and hope to see God's face. Out of one blood, God made all nations.
America's problem. On my fundraising tour, I called racism America's problem. Whatever you give, I told the crowd, it's not only to free me in Mississippi, it's also to free yourselves, because no one is free in this land. Racists can be some kind of rats, though. In 1967, my daughter Dorothy took sick after her second child was born. I drove more than 90 miles all the way to Memphis, Tennessee, to find a hospital that would treat blacks. Then, right outside the hospital main entrance, my Dorothy passed away in my arms. Gone. Just like that. Because she's sick and couldn't get enough to eat. Now me and Pap got grandbabies to raise. I prayed their future would be brighter. In 1967, Robert Clark, a Freedom Democrat, cracked the door to the State House. He was the first black person elected to the Mississippi legislature since Reconstruction, when slavery had just ended. In 1968, Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, a senator running for president, were both killed. Those were dark days.
No rest. summer of 1968, I sat at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago as part of the Loyalist delegation, what was formed to crush the Freedom Democrats. Still, I let my voice be heard for aid to farmers and against the war in Vietnam. I was weary as an old soldier, but I couldn't rest. No, I couldn't. Not as long as blacks was poor, schools was segregated, and black teachers was discriminated against. Not as long as laws be holding women back. One day an old white man told me he appreciated me doing what he was afraid to do. Ain't no tellin' how long he'd wanted change. He could not be free until I was free. I had always believed we serve God by serving our fellow man, and no child should know what hunger is. So I started a freedom farm, a pig bank, and a Head Start program, and I helped folks living in shacks get hold of government housing loans. I mined a lot of pots. I had given my 2 cents to the women's liberation movement. I won a lawsuit against Sunflower County to integrate the public schools, and I lost a bid for state senate in 1971. The outcome was rigged against me. But 55 blacks was elected in Mississippi that year, a record for a southern state. And in 1976, the Congressional Black Caucus, made up of black Congress people, given me a lifelong service award. Maybe I had won after all.
Author's note. Fannie Lou Hammer, 1917 to 1977, was known as the spirit or the voice of the civil rights movement. Perhaps she was both. With her powerful singing and passionate, plain-spoken oratory, the granddaughter of slaves and the youngest of 20 children born to sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta, Hammer was an unlikely heroine. Born in 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi, she had polio as a child and started picking cotton at the age of 6. Although she was a good student, she dropped out of school in the 6th grade to help her family in the field. At home and in the field, she grew up listening to African American spirituals. In 1944, Hammer married sharecropper Perry Papham Hammer and moved to the Marlowe plantation. She was unable to have children after surgery that state ordered for poor women, though Hammer and her husband adopted 2 daughters. At the Marlowe place, Hammer cooked and cleaned in the owner's home because she had mathematical skills. She also tapped in to keep time, weigh the cotton, and pay workers their share. Although the plantation owner rigged the scales to cheat the sharecroppers, Hammer strove to be fair, using her own scale whenever she could. In the Mississippi Delta, daily life was so grueling, poverty so great that Hammer did not realize voting was her right until a young grassroots organizer immobilized her community. When she tried to register to vote, she not only failed the poll test, she also faced backlash from the plantation owner. He fired her, made her move off the plantation without her family, and they eventually reunited in a house in town. By then, Hammer was working tirelessly for racial equality. In 1963, after demanding service at a whites-only cafe, she was jailed and brutally beaten in Winona, Mississippi. The injuries plagued her the rest of her life. Still, she rose from a community activist to become a national spokesperson for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Hammer spoke at rallies on college campuses, moving audiences with her booming voice and soulful singing. On the front lines of the freedom struggle, she joined sit-ins, led voter education training. She marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She helped form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She addressed the 1964 Democratic National Convention, exposing voter discrimination. Hammer ran 3 times for elected office. Beyond the civil rights movement, Hammer helped start a Head Start preschool program and ran a farm project to reduce hunger in her community. She also led the Cotton Pickers Resistance Movement and co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus. In 1969, Tougaloo College awarded Hammer an honorary doctorate degree, and in 1972, the Mississippi House of Representatives recognized her with a proclamation. She died in 1977. Today, a street, post office, youth center, and a memorial park bear Hammer's name in her hometown of Ruleville, Mississippi. There are so many marvelous books to read beyond this one.
Just to give props to the author and the illustrator, Carol Boston Weatherford has written more than 35 books for children and young adults, including the Caldecott Honor book Moses, When Harriet Tubman Led Her People to Freedom, illustrated by Kadir Nelson. This is her first book with Candlewick Press. She lives in North Carolina. The illustrator, Akua Holmes, is a fine artist who finds inspiration for her work in family, childhood, relationships, hope, and faith. In 2013, she was named to the Boston Arts Commission, which oversees public art projects on city property. Voice of Freedom is her picture book debut. She lives in Boston. Check it out, folks.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, friends.
Petra.